as I mentioned before, 3 proxy indicators of nationalism. I won't dwell on that and go over it again. But just to point out the scope, this is very much focused on nationalism at the popular level, rather than at the elite level. And quite arguably, it's nationalism at the elite level that has the most direct influence on foreign policy making. So that might be more important, but it's much more inaccessible to researchers like me. So I'm focused on the nationalism at the popular level, mainly because there's a lot of assumptions being sort of taken for granted about this topic, and it's time to bring some empirical evidence to bear on it. So next slide, please. So the first proxy I use is some original survey data that I fielded in 2013 as part of my PhD dissertation. Wasn't a nationally representative sample as such, but it was representative within the 5 major cities that it was conducted. And it was conducted by a commercial firm as part of an omnibus survey that included a bunch of other topics. So it wasn't people knocking on the door and coming to ask you about the South China Sea, which would have been problematic, I think more problematic from the point of view of the interpretation of the results. This still remains, to my knowledge, the most detailed survey that we have when it comes to Chinese views of the South China Sea issue. We asked about people's levels of attention to the issue, about the sources of information that they rely upon for news about this issue, their assessment of the government's performance, their policy preferences for how it should be handled, their belief in the validity of China's various claims in the South China Sea, and also, I think quite interestingly, their degree of agreement, as we'll come to in a sec, with the degree of agreement that this fits into those national humiliation frames that the nationalism literature in China has focused a lot of attention on. Next slide, please. So first of all, what this survey showed was that at least by 2013, and I think I made various arguments in the paper as to why we should expect that this was already the case before then, popular nationalism does exist. It's not simply an elite phenomenon, at least by 2013. We've got nearly 46% of the respondents in these 5 cities agreeing that China should send in the troops and potentially go to war in order to handle the Philippines and Vietnam in the South China Sea. So linking that back to those nationalism literatures, and the one that I sort of flagged before as perhaps the most promising, this is a very clear implied desire to punish the other when it comes to these foreign policy preferences. A desire to send in the troops, don't show the war. However, we do need to interpret that percentage with some care, because the particular wording that I used, 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝘁 is a kind of wording that kind of primes you to agree with it. It's sort of, at least within Chinese language, it sounds like the sort of thing, especially if you're steeped in the online discourse, and I'll come to that in a second. It's the sort of wording that you'd be inclined to agree with. So it might not be as high as 46% of people want a war in the South China Sea by 2013, but it's certainly a substantial proportion of the population that think that sounds like a good idea. What's interesting also is that in the same survey, we also asked the same question about the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands issue, which was very, very heated at the time, Sino-Japanese relations. In fact, 𝗃𝗃𝗁 and Pete were writing about it at that time. And the percentage of respondents agreeing that China shouldn't show the war, to just send in the troops, was actually higher for the South China Sea at that time than it was for the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, despite how heated the nationalist sentiments were towards Japan at the time. So that's another indication of the strength of feeling and the desire to punish the outgroup when it comes to the South China Sea as of 2013, and I argue sometime before. Next slide, please. Another interesting finding out of this was that one of the most popular options, policy options, was involving the public itself. So channeling domestic public opinion, encouraging the masses to show dissatisfaction towards the disputed country. Nearly 66% of respondents agreed that that was a good way of handling the South China Sea dispute. And this sort of dovetails with some other research which shows that people the other study that I'm citing here was based on students, but they found that the students believed that their own participation in anti-Japanese protests was actually useful, instrumentally useful to the state. And it also dovetails with a couple of little tidbits from larger studies of Sino-Japanese relations, such as James Riley's. Next slide, please. This is where it gets interesting in terms of how it relates to the media discourse, because what we find is that it's not the state organs which are the source of this nationalist sentiment, this desire to punish the Philippines and Vietnam through military means. Actually, the green is the percentage of agreement with sending in the troops, and the green on this side is compromise through negotiation, the more compromising option. And this is how frequently people get their information on the issue from the state media, from television in particular. So you can see it's actually generally those that, this is never, sometimes, and often. So people who get the information from the state media are actually less inclined overall to want to send in the troops and punish the Philippines and Vietnam and the South China Sea, and they're more likely to favour compromise. Next slide, please. So the state media are not the source of this nationalism. The internet, on the other hand, you might think, well, if it's not the state media, then it's got to be that rancorous, nationalistic online discourse that I'll also be talking about if we've got time. But actually, it's not clear that the internet universally just drives people towards a nationalistic viewpoint. It looks much more like it's about audiences' predispositions, and on the internet you can find material to confirm your existing predilections. And so the internet, on the other, it doesn't push people away from those militaristic stances like the charts in the previous slide were indicating the state media do, but it sustains those militaristic preferences because people can find confirmatory information if they want it. What the internet also does, though, which I find quite interesting, is that the people who are getting their information from online sources, sometimes that is the people who are moderately engaged with the issue, as opposed to people who are often getting information about it from the internet. Those are the people who are, you can infer that they're relatively engaged with the issue and have fairly strong pre-existing views. It's those that are getting the internet information sometimes that believe most strongly in China's claims. And this is consistent across all three of the major South China Sea disputes. And this relates to some media theories from 𝗱𝗲𝗁 back in the 60s and the exposure acceptance model, which basically says that there's people moderately engaged in the middle who are the most subject to media influence. So that's the interpretation I have of this pattern here. But it's another, I'd be interested to hear if there are alternative explanations from among the audience. Next slide, please. And this is also quite interesting, the last slide about the survey results. We see overwhelming agreement with the proposition that the ongoing presence of the Philippines and Vietnam on islands claimed by China in the South China Sea is a matter of national dignity. It's a matter of the state's dignity, for sure. It's a continuation of the century of humiliation by 𝗱𝗲𝘁. More than 80% agreement with that proposition. And it only goes down a little bit when you start talking about the Chinese nation, rather than making it specifically about the state. So this is quite interesting because I don't think this is a position that the party state particularly finds useful. Say propound the century of humiliation narrative. The point of that has been to re-legitimize the state. So having narratives like this and interpretations like this floating around is not exactly beneficial to the state's legitimacy. So from that we can infer that this is probably an indication of a more popular interpretation of the current status quo, as of 2013 at least, in the South China Sea, rather than something that's propounded by the state. And we'll see how that framing of the century of humiliation has played out in terms of the way people talk about it online.